morning sun barely filtered through the tall windows of the county courthouse as Rebecca Chen pushed through the heavy wooden doors. Her hands were sweaty, and she kept adjusting the strap of her old briefcase, a gift from her mother years ago that had seen better days. The leather was cracked at the corners, and one of the clasps didn't quite close right anymore. But it was hers, and it had gotten her through law school and countless court appearances. She was early. Too early, actually. But that's how she always operated. Being early meant having time to breathe, to think, to prepare herself for whatever the day might throw at her. The courthouse hallways were still relatively quiet, with only a few lawyers shuffling past, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. Rebecca glanced down at her own shoes, clean but definitely showing their age. She'd polished them the night before, trying to make them look as professional as possible. Making her way to courtroom 4B, she slipped inside and took a seat in the back row of the gallery. She wanted to observe the morning proceedings before her turn came. This was something she'd learned early in her career. Watch how different judges handle their courtrooms, learn from other attorneys, and always stay sharp. The courtroom was almost empty except for a court clerk organizing papers at her desk and a janitor quietly working in the corner. Rebecca pulled out her notes and began reviewing them one more time. Her hands moved automatically, flipping through pages she'd already read dozens of times. This was more about calming her nerves than actual preparation at this point. She'd learned every detail of her case backward and forward. That's what you did when you cared about your work. When every case mattered because behind every file was a real person whose life hung in the balance. The peace didn't last long. The courtroom doors swung open with more force than necessary, and 3 police officers walked in, their boots heavy against the floor. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying through the quiet space with that particular brand of confidence that comes from wearing a badge. The tallest one, Officer Derek Hayes, noticed Rebecca sitting in the gallery, and his eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long. He nudged one of his colleagues and whispered something that made them both chuckle. Then, to Rebecca's surprise, he started walking toward her. His hand rested casually on his belt, near his radio, and that smirk, that knowing, condescending smirk was already forming on his face. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I think you might be in the wrong courtroom. Traffic violations are handled downstairs in 2A. Rebecca looked up from her notes, her expression neutral. "I'm in the right place, thank you." Officer Hayes raised his eyebrows, clearly not expecting to be contradicted. His eyes scanned her again, taking in her simple black dress, professional but inexpensive, her worn briefcase, and those shoes she'd polished so carefully the night before. His smirk grew wider. "Oh, I see. You're waiting for your case to be called?" He said it loudly enough that the other officers could hear, and they started paying attention now, sensing entertainment. "Public defender, right? Or are you representing yourself? Because if you are, honey, let me give you some free advice. Get a real lawyer." The other officers snickered. One of them, a younger guy with a fresh haircut, actually laughed out loud. Rebecca felt her face grow warm, but she kept her expression steady. She'd dealt with people like this before. People who looked at her and saw only what they wanted to see. People who made assumptions based on appearance, who judged a book by its cover without ever bothering to read a single page. "I appreciate your concern," Rebecca said quietly. Her voice controlled. "But I'm exactly where I need to be." Officer Hayes leaned against the bench near her, getting comfortable like he had all the time in the world. "Look, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen every kind of case, every kind of lawyer. And trust me, you've got that look. Young, probably fresh out of some second-rate law school, taking on cases you can't win because nobody else wants them. Am I right?" Rebecca didn't answer. She simply returned her attention to her notes, hoping he'd take the hint and leave her alone. But Officer Hayes wasn't done. In fact, her silence seemed to encourage him. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" He glanced back at his colleagues, playing to his audience now. "I'm just trying to help here. The legal system can be brutal if you don't know what you're doing. Maybe you should observe how the real attorneys handle things before you jump in the deep end." The younger officer chimed in, emboldened by his superior's behavior. "Yeah, and make sure you stand when the judge enters. Rookie mistake a lot of people make. Shows disrespect to the court." They were all laughing now, treating Rebecca like she was some naive kid who'd wandered into the courthouse by accident. The court clerk glanced over, her expression uncomfortable, but she said nothing. This was the dance everyone knew. Officers had power, and speaking up against them, even when they were clearly out of line, could make your job a lot harder. Rebecca closed her briefcase carefully, the broken clasp clicking into place with some effort. She looked up at Officer Hayes, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "I know how to show respect to the court," she said evenly. "Do you?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Officer Hayes' smirk faltered just slightly before returning full force. "Ooh, she's got some attitude. I like that. You're going to need it in there." He pushed off from the bench, straightening his uniform. "Good luck, sweetheart. You're going to need it," as he walked away, rejoining his colleagues near the front of the courtroom. Rebecca heard them continuing their conversation in lower tones, occasionally glancing back at her with amused expressions. She knew what they were saying. More jokes, more assumptions, more judgments about who she was and what she was capable of, based on nothing more than how she looked sitting in that gallery. The thing was, Officer Hayes had made one very accurate observation. The legal system could indeed be brutal. But not for the reasons he thought. It was brutal because of people exactly like him. People who decided someone's worth based on superficial things. Who wielded their authority like a weapon. Who forgot that respect was supposed to flow in all directions, not just upward. Rebecca took a slow, deep breath and checked her watch. Just 15 more minutes. 15 minutes until everything changed. 15 minutes until Officer Derek Hayes learned the most important lesson of his career. She returned her attention to her notes one final time, though she wasn't really reading them anymore. Her mind was elsewhere, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The late nights studying in her car because her apartment was too cold. The jobs she'd worked to pay for law school, waitressing, cleaning offices, tutoring students. The professors who'd doubted her, the interviewers who'd overlooked her, the opposing counsel who'd underestimated her. Every single one of them had taught her something valuable. Never let anyone's opinion of you become your reality. Work twice as hard as everyone else. Let your actions speak louder than their assumptions. And most importantly, when you finally get your moment, when you finally reach that position you've worked so hard for, remember exactly how it felt to be underestimated, dismissed and mocked. Remember it so you never, ever do it to someone else. The clock on the wall ticked forward. People began filtering into the courtroom, taking their seats. Lawyers in expensive suits, defendants with worried faces, family members clutching tissues. The energy in the room shifted from sleepy morning quiet to anticipatory tension. Officer Hayes was at the front now, chatting with the prosecutor, both of them relaxed and confident. He hadn't given Rebecca another thought. She was already forgotten, just another face in the crowd, another nobody who'd briefly crossed his path. But Rebecca hadn't forgotten. And in about 10 minutes, Officer Derek Hayes was going to have the shock of his life. To understand what was about to happen in that courtroom, you'd have to go back 20 years, back to a small apartment on the wrong side of town where a young Rebecca Chen lived, with her mother in a place that always seemed too cold in winter and too hot in summer. Her mother worked 2 jobs, mornings at a laundromat and evenings, cleaning office buildings downtown. Rebecca would often go with her to those office buildings after school, doing her homework in empty conference rooms while her mother vacuumed and emptied trash cans. She'd sit at those big expensive tables and imagine what it would be like to be one of the people who worked there, who belonged there, who didn't have to slip in through the service entrance. The lawyers' offices fascinated her most. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal texts, big wooden desks, diplomas hanging on walls in fancy frames. Her mother would dust those diplomas carefully, and young Rebecca would read every single one. Harvard, Yale, Columbia. Names that seemed like they belonged to a different universe. Not to a kid whose shoes had holes in them and whose lunch was often whatever was cheapest at the convenience store. You could do that, her mother told her once, catching her staring at a particularly impressive wall of achievements. You're smart enough. Smarter than most of these people, I bet. Rebecca had laughed it off. Kids from her neighborhood didn't become lawyers. They became mechanics, nurses if they were lucky, or they ended up working the same kind of jobs their parents did. That was just how life worked. There was an invisible line separating people like her from people like those lawyers, and crossing it seemed about as likely as flying to the moon. But her mother didn't let it go. Every report card, every teacher's comment about Rebecca's sharp mind and natural ability to argue her point, her mother saved them all in a folder she kept in their apartment. Evidence, she called it. Evidence that you're meant for something more. High school was tough. Rebecca was smart, sure, but smart wasn't always enough. She didn't have a computer at home when everyone else did. She couldn't afford the SAT prep courses her classmates took. She wore the same rotation of clothes week after week, and kids noticed. They always notice. But she had something else, a fire that wouldn't go out. When a guidance counselor suggested she consider community college or maybe a trade school, Rebecca applied to 15 universities instead. When she got rejected from most of them, she didn't crumble. She got into State University with a partial scholarship, and she figured out the rest. College was where she learned what real hard work meant. Her classmates complained about being tired after studying for a few hours. Rebecca would go to class, work a shift at a diner, study until midnight, then wake up at 5 to do it all again. She slept in her car some nights because it was easier than driving all the way home just to turn around and come back. Her roommate freshman year was a girl named Ashley from a wealthy suburb. Ashley's parents sent her care packages filled with expensive snacks and new clothes. They paid her tuition in full, gave her a credit card for emergencies, bought her a car. Ashley was nice enough, but she lived in a completely different world. She'd complain about her parents being annoying, and Rebecca would think about her mother scrubbing toilets to help pay for the textbooks Rebecca needed. The contrast was everywhere. Group projects where other students could afford to not work and just focus on school. Spring breaks where everyone seemed to go on trips while Rebecca picked up extra shifts. Networking events where knowing the right people opened doors that hard work alone couldn't budge. But Rebecca kept pushing. She graduated with honors, which felt like a miracle considering everything she'd juggled. Her mother came to the ceremony in her best dress, the one she wore to church, and cried through the whole thing. It was one of the best days of Rebecca's life. Then came law school, which made undergraduate work look easy by comparison. She got into a decent school, not top tier, but respectable. Her loans were astronomical. The numbers made her physically sick when she really thought about them. But what choice did she have? This was the path forward, the only way to build the life she wanted. Law school was brutal. The reading was endless. The pressure was crushing. And the competition. Everyone was smart here. Everyone was driven, and many of them had advantages Rebecca couldn't even imagine. They had parents who were lawyers, who could explain cases and offer guidance. They had financial safety nets that meant they could focus entirely on studying instead of worrying about rent. Rebecca worked 3 jobs during law school. 3. She waitressed at a restaurant near campus, cleaned houses on weekends, and tutored undergrads in the evenings. Her classmates thought she was crazy. Some of them asked why she didn't just take out more loans, and she had to explain that she'd already maxed out what she could borrow. More wasn't an option. She studied in her car between shifts, keeping her casebooks in the back seat. She made flashcards on scrap paper from the restaurant where she worked. She recorded herself reading cases and listened to them while she cleaned houses, earbuds tucked under her hair so the clients wouldn't see. There were moments she wanted to quit. Dark moments, usually around 2 in the morning when she was exhausted and still had 50 pages to read for the next day's class. Moments when she'd see other students talking about their weekend plans or their summer internships at prestigious firms, and she'd think about how unfair it all was. But then she'd remember her mother, still working those 2 jobs even though her back hurt and her feet ached, still putting away $20 here and there to send to Rebecca, still believing that her daughter was going to make it. Rebecca passed the bar exam on her first try. Not everyone did, but she did. She was now officially a lawyer, which should have felt like the finish line. Instead, it felt like she'd just qualified to run an even harder race. The job search was humbling. Big firms weren't interested in someone from her background, from her school, with her lack of connections. She sent out hundreds of applications and got back mostly silence. The few interviews she landed felt like formalities. They'd already decided she wasn't the right fit before she walked in the door. She ended up as a public defender. It wasn't the glamorous path some of her classmates took, but it was honest work. Important work. She represented people who couldn't afford lawyers. People who the system often chewed up and spit out without a second thought. People who reminded her of her younger self, just trying to survive in a world that seemed designed to keep them down. For 7 years, Rebecca worked as a public defender. 7 years of impossible caseloads, of clients who'd been failed by every system meant to help them, of prosecutors and judges who sometimes forgot that the defendants were human beings with stories and circumstances that mattered. She won cases that everyone said were unwinnable. She fought for clients that other lawyers had given up on. She worked weekends and holidays because justice didn't take a break, and neither could she. Her apartment was small, her car was old, and her student loan balance barely budged despite her monthly payments. But she was good at what she did. Really good. Her reputation grew slowly but surely. Other lawyers started noticing her. How thoroughly she prepared, how passionately she argued, how she treated every client with dignity regardless of what they'd been accused of. Judges noticed too. Even the ones who ruled against her respected the quality of her work. Then 2 years ago, something unexpected happened. Judge Martinez, who'd presided over the county court for nearly 20 years, announced his retirement. A vacancy like this was rare, and it set off a scramble. Everyone wanted to know who would be appointed to fill such an important position. Several senior lawyers applied, people with decades of experience, with political connections, with the kind of pedigree that usually guaranteed these appointments. Rebecca didn't even consider applying at first. Judges came from big firms, from positions of prestige and power. They didn't come from overcrowded public defender offices. But her mentor, an older attorney who'd watched her career with interest, pulled her aside one day. "You should apply," he said simply. Rebecca laughed. "Be serious. I'm serious. You're one of the best lawyers I've seen in 30 years of practice. You understand the law, you understand people, and most importantly, you understand what justice actually means." That's rare, so she applied, expecting nothing. She filled out the lengthy application late at night after work, detailing her experience, her philosophy, her vision for how a courtroom should operate. She submitted it and tried to forget about it. Weeks passed, then months. She figured she'd been passed over, which was fine. It had been a long shot anyway. Then she got the call. The call that changed everything. The call that led to interviews, to vetting, to background checks, to references. The call that ultimately led to a quiet afternoon 3 weeks ago when she received official word. She'd been selected. Rebecca Chen was going to be a judge. She'd told almost no one. Her mother knew, of course, a few close friends, but she'd kept it quiet, waiting for the official ceremony where she'd take her oath and the appointment would become public. That ceremony was scheduled for this morning, in courtroom 4B. The same courtroom where Officer Derek Hayes had just mocked her, assuming she was some inexperienced public defender out of her depth. The same courtroom where, in just a few minutes, everything was about to change. The courtroom had filled up considerably in the last few minutes. Lawyers shuffled papers at their tables. Defendants sat nervously beside their attorneys. Family members whispered in the gallery. The usual morning chaos of a busy courthouse was in full swing. Rebecca remained in her seat in the back row, perfectly still, watching everything. Officer Hayes stood near the prosecutor's table, leaning casually against the railing like he owned the place. He was laughing at something his colleague had said, completely relaxed, completely confident. He'd already forgotten about the woman he'd mocked just minutes earlier. The court clerk, Mrs. Patterson, was an older woman who'd worked in this courthouse for over 30 years. She knew everyone, had seen everything, and very little surprised her anymore. She glanced at Rebecca sitting in the gallery and allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Mrs. Patterson was one of the few people who knew exactly what was about to happen, and she'd been looking forward to this moment for weeks. The bailiff, a tall man named Rodriguez, entered through the side door. He was carrying the black judicial robe, freshly pressed and hanging carefully over his arm. He nodded at Mrs. Patterson, who checked her watch and nodded back. It was time. Officer Hayes noticed the bailiff and straightened up slightly. Court was about to begin. He'd testified in this courtroom dozens of times, and the routine was always the same. "The judge will," would enter. Everyone would stand, and then they'd get through the morning docket. Smooth and predictable. He had a few cases today, nothing major, just standard testimony about arrests and evidence. Easy stuff. The prosecutor, a woman named Linda Walsh, was reviewing her files one last time. She was thorough and professional, the kind of attorney who prepared meticulously for every case. She'd been told that today was special, that there would be a ceremony before regular proceedings, but the details had been kept surprisingly quiet. Budget cuts, she'd figured, or maybe some administrative thing. She didn't give it much thought. Rodriguez moved to the front of the courtroom and cleared his throat. The conversations died down as everyone sensed that court was about to begin. This was the moment everyone knew, the moment you stopped talking and paid attention. "All rise," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying through the courtroom with practiced authority. Everyone stood. Chairs scraped against the floor. Papers rustled. The sound of dozens of people rising to their feet filled the space. This was standard procedure, happened every single day in every courtroom across the country. Nothing unusual. But then Rodriguez continued, and his next words made several people in the courtroom freeze. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Rebecca Chen." There was a beat of silence. Complete, total silence. The kind of silence that happens when something so unexpected occurs that people's brains need a moment to catch up with what they just heard. Officer Hayes's face went blank. Not confused yet, just blank. He was still processing the name, still trying to make sense of it. His eyes automatically went to the judge's door at the side of the bench, expecting to see someone enter from there. That's where judges came from. That side door that led to their chambers, but nobody came through that door. Instead, there was movement from the gallery, from the back row. Rebecca stood up, picked up her worn briefcase, and began walking toward the front of the courtroom. Her footsteps were quiet but steady. Every eye in the room turned to watch her. Officer Hayes saw her moving and his confusion deepened. Was she leaving? Was she scared after he'd talked to her? But she wasn't walking toward the exit. She was walking toward the front, toward the gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court. The gate swung open. Rebecca stepped through. That's when understanding started to dawn on Officer Hayes's face. His mouth opened slightly. His eyes widened. But it still didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. The woman he'd mocked, the woman he'd assumed was some inexperienced public defender or nervous defendant, she couldn't be. Rebecca walked past the lawyers' tables, past the prosecutor, past Officer Hayes, who stood frozen, his face now visibly pale. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him. She just kept walking with calm, measured steps toward the bench. The 3 steps up to the judge's seat seemed to take forever and no time at all. Rebecca climbed them steadily, her hand briefly touching the polished wood railing. When she reached the top, she turned to face the courtroom. Rodriguez approached with the judicial robe, and the entire courtroom watched in absolute silence as Rebecca extended her arms and he helped her into it. The black robe settled onto her shoulders like it had always belonged there. She adjusted it slightly, smoothing the fabric, and then she was standing there in full judicial robes behind the bench, looking out at a courtroom full of stunned faces. Officer Hayes looked like he might be sick. All the color had drained from his face. His earlier swagger, that cocky confidence, had evaporated completely. He stood there in his uniform, his hand gripping the railing in front of him, staring up at the woman he'd called sweetheart and honey. The woman he'd told to get a real lawyer. The woman he'd laughed at with his colleagues. His colleagues weren't laughing now either. The younger officer who'd made the comment about standing for the judge looked absolutely mortified. The third officer was staring down at his shoes like he wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole. The prosecutor's mouth was actually hanging open. She closed it quickly, professional instincts kicking in, but her eyes were wide with shock. Several lawyers in the courtroom who'd watched Officer Hayes mock Rebecca were exchanging glances, some of them fighting back smiles. This was going to be the talk of the courthouse for months. Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk, wasn't even trying to hide her satisfaction. She'd worked with Rebecca on several cases over the years and had always been impressed by her dedication and fairness. When she'd learned Rebecca was being appointed, she'd been thrilled. And when she'd witnessed Officer Hayes's behavior earlier, she'd been quietly furious. Justice, she thought, had a sense of humor after all. Rebecca let the moment breathe. She stood there, allowing everyone to fully absorb what was happening. She wasn't rushing. This wasn't about drama or revenge. This was simply reality asserting itself. The reality that you cannot judge a person's worth, capability, or position based on how they look or where they sit in a courtroom. Finally, Rebecca spoke. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying easily through the silent room. "Thank you all for being here this morning," she began. "For those who don't know me, my name is Rebecca Chen, and I have been appointed to serve as judge of this court. Before we proceed with today's docket, I will be taking my oath of office." Officer Hayes was still staring, still trying to process. His mind had to be racing. Every word he'd said to her, every condescending comment, every assumption, it was playing back in his head now with horrifying clarity. The woman he'd treated like she didn't belong was now the judge who would preside over his cases, the person who would evaluate his testimony, the authority in this courtroom. The ceremony proceeded. A senior judge from another courtroom entered to administer the oath. Rebecca placed her hand on a Bible that Mrs. Patterson held for her, the same Bible her mother had given her when she graduated from law school, carried with her today for exactly this moment. "Do you solemnly swear that you will administer justice without respect to persons and do equal right to the poor and to the rich, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon you as judge under the Constitution and laws of the United States, so help you God?" Rebecca's voice was steady and clear. "I do." The senior judge smiled and shook her hand. "Congratulations, Your Honor." Those words, "Your Honor," hung in the air. Officer Hayes heard them and felt something twist in his stomach. "Your Honor." The woman he'd called sweetheart just 20 minutes ago was now Your Honor. A few people in the courtroom began to applaud. It started small but grew quickly. Lawyers, court staff, even some of the defendants and their families joined in. This was a significant moment. A new judge taking office was always important. But there was something extra special about this particular appointment. Many people in that room knew Rebecca's reputation, knew her background, knew what she'd overcome to get here. Rebecca acknowledged the applause with a gracious nod, then gestured for everyone to sit. The room settled. The ceremony was over. Now came the real work. She looked down at the docket for the day, her eyes scanning the list of cases. And there, fourth on the list, was one of Officer Hayes's cases, a routine traffic stop that had resulted in an arrest. He was scheduled to testify about the circumstances of the stop and what he'd observed. Rebecca looked up from the docket and her eyes met Officer Hayes's for just a brief moment. His face was still pale, his expression a mixture of embarrassment, fear, and something else, maybe the first stirrings of understanding about what he'd done and why it mattered. She gave nothing away in her expression. No anger, no satisfaction, no vindication, just professional neutrality. Because that's what judges do. They set aside personal feelings and focus on the law, on fairness, on treating every person in their courtroom with equal dignity. "Let's begin with the morning's proceedings," Rebecca said, her voice calm and authoritative. "Mrs. Patterson, please call the first case." The courthouse had just learned a lesson it wouldn't soon forget, and Officer Derek Hayes was about to learn what it really meant to face someone you'd underestimated. The first 3 cases on the docket moved quickly. A sentencing for a minor theft charge, a preliminary hearing for a DUI, and a motion hearing that took all of 10 minutes. Rebecca handled each one with practiced efficiency, asking clear questions, listening carefully to arguments, and making fair rulings. People in the courtroom watched her work, and you could see the respect building with each decision she made, but everyone knew what was coming. Case number 4, the one where Officer Hayes would have to take the stand. Mrs. Patterson called it out. Case number 2024 CR 1847, State versus Michael Porter. A young defense attorney stood up along with his client, a nervous-looking man in his mid-20s wearing an ill-fitting suit. The prosecutor, Linda Walsh, gathered her files and approached her table. And Officer Hayes, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, walked slowly to the witness area. Rebecca watched him approach without any visible reaction. Her face was composed, professional, exactly what you'd expect from a judge. But inside that courtroom, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every lawyer, every clerk, every person in the gallery was paying attention now. They all knew what had happened earlier. They'd all seen or heard about Officer Hayes's comments. And now they were about to see how Judge Chen would handle it. Officer Hayes reached the witness stand and stopped, waiting to be sworn in. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it. The bailiff administered the oath, and Hayes's voice came out quieter than usual. "I do." He sat down, and for the first time in probably his entire career, he looked genuinely uncomfortable on a witness stand. He'd testified hundreds of times before, always confident, always in control, but this was different. This was the woman he'd mocked sitting above him, wearing the robes of authority, with the power to make his professional life very difficult if she chose to. The prosecutor began her direct examination. Standard questions about the traffic stop, when it occurred, what he observed, why he initiated the stop. Officer Hayes answered each question, but his usual confident tone was gone. He kept glancing up at Rebecca, like he was waiting for her to say something, to acknowledge what had happened between them, to punish him somehow. But Rebecca just listened. She took notes occasionally, her expression neutral. When the prosecutor finished, she nodded to the defense attorney. Cross-examination? The defense attorney stood up, a young guy who'd probably been practicing for less than 5 years. He asked pointed questions about the stop, about what Officer Hayes could actually see from his position, about the timing of events. Good questions, the kind that poked holes in the prosecution's timeline. At one point, Officer Hayes's answer contradicted something he'd said in his police report. The defense attorney caught it immediately and pressed him on it. Hayes stumbled over his words, clearly flustered, trying to explain the discrepancy. He looked up at Rebecca, perhaps hoping she'd step in, but she remained silent, letting the examination continue as it should. When the defense attorney finished, Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "Officer Hayes, I have a few questions for you." The courtroom went completely silent. This was it. Everyone waited to see what she would do. Hayes straightened in his chair, his jaw tight. "Yes, Your Honor." Rebecca's voice was calm and measured. "In your report, you stated that you observed the defendant's vehicle swerving within its lane at approximately 11:47 p.m. Can you describe the weather conditions at that time?" Hayes blinked, clearly surprised by the straightforward question. It was raining, Your Honor. Moderate rain." "And the road surface?" "Wet, Your Honor." "What was the posted speed limit on that stretch of road?" 45 miles per hour, Your Honor." Rebecca made a note. "And how fast was the defendant traveling when you observed this alleged swerving?" Hayes consulted his report. "Approximately 40 miles per hour, Your Honor. So 5 miles under the speed limit on a wet road in the rain?" "Yes, Your Honor." Rebecca paused, letting that sink in for everyone in the courtroom. Then she asked, "Have you ever driven on a wet road, Officer Hayes?" "Yes, Your Honor, many times." "Have you ever had to adjust your position within your lane due to water pooling, reduced visibility, or other weather-related factors?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably. He saw where this was going. "Yes, Your Honor, I have." "But you interpreted this driver's adjustment as suspicious enough to justify a traffic stop?" The young defense attorney was watching this exchange with barely contained excitement. His client, the defendant, looked hopeful for the first time since entering the courtroom. Officer Hayes cleared his throat. "Your Honor, in my experience, erratic driving can be an indicator of impairment, and I believed I had reasonable suspicion to initiate the stop." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I see. And during your interaction with Mr. Porter, did you administer any field sobriety tests?" "Yes, Your Honor, he passed all of them." "And the breathalyzer?" 0.00, Your Honor. So he was completely sober?" "Yes, Your Honor." Rebecca set down her pen and looked directly at Officer Hayes. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. She could destroy him right now if she wanted to. She could make a comment about his judgment, his professionalism, his tendency to make assumptions about people. She could reference their earlier encounter, put him on blast in front of everyone. The power to humiliate him, just as he'd tried to humiliate her, was right there in her hands. Instead, she said simply, "Thank you, Officer Hayes. You may step down." That was it. No lecture. No public shaming. No vindictive comments. Just a fair examination of his testimony, the kind any judge would conduct, followed by a dismissal. Officer Hayes stood up slowly, looking almost confused. He'd been bracing for something worse, waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it never did. He walked back to his seat, and you could see him processing what had just happened, or rather what hadn't happened. Rebecca turned her attention to the attorneys. "Counselors, I've heard the testimony. Ms. Walsh, while I appreciate Officer Hayes' diligence, I find that the traffic stop was initiated on questionable grounds. A driver traveling under the speed limit and making minor adjustments on a wet road does not constitute reasonable suspicion of impairment or violation of traffic laws." The defense attorney tried not to smile too. Broadly, Rebecca continued, "Therefore, I'm granting the defense's motion to suppress all evidence obtained as a result of this stop. Ms. Walsh, unless you have additional evidence not connected to this stop, I suggest you consider your options regarding this case." The prosecutor nodded, already knowing this case was over. "The state will dismiss, Your Honor." "So ordered." Rebecca tapped her gavel once. "Mr. Porter, you're free to go." The young man looked stunned. His attorney shook his hand, whispering explanations. Officer Hayes sat in his seat, staring at the floor. He'd just had his case dismissed, his judgment questioned, his testimony effectively rejected. But he'd also just witnessed something else. Grace. Rebecca could have humiliated him. She could have made an example of him in the worst possible way. Instead, she'd simply done her job. She'd examined the evidence fairly, applied the law correctly, and made a decision based on facts rather than personal feelings. She'd shown him what real professionalism looked like. After a brief recess, the morning docket continued. Rebecca handled each case with the same careful attention, the same fairness, the same dignity. She was tough when she needed to be, calling out an attorney who hadn't prepared adequately, denying a motion that was clearly without merit. But she was never cruel, never condescending, never anything like the way Officer Hayes had been to her. During the lunch break, the courthouse buzzed with conversation. Everyone was talking about the new judge, about what had happened, about the grace she'd shown. Several lawyers who'd practiced for decades said they'd rarely seen someone handle a situation like that with such class. Officer Hayes sat alone in a quiet corner of the courthouse cafeteria, staring at his untouched sandwich. His colleagues had tried to talk to him, but he'd brushed them off. He needed to think, needed to process what had happened and what it meant. He'd spent 15 years as a cop, developing instincts about people, learning to read situations quickly. But those same instincts had failed him spectacularly this morning. He'd looked at Rebecca and seen only surface details, her worn briefcase, her modest clothes, her age. He'd made assumptions based on appearances and treated her accordingly. And he'd been completely wrong. But what bothered him most wasn't that he'd been wrong. It was how she'd responded. She had every right to embarrass him, to make his morning miserable, to use her new position to put him in his place. He'd certainly given her reason to. Instead, she'd treated him with the same professional courtesy she showed everyone else. She'd been fair. More than fair. That afternoon, when court resumed, Officer Hayes had one more case to testify in. When his name was called, he approached the stand differently than he had that morning. His swagger was gone, replaced by something more humble. He answered questions directly and honestly, without any of his usual embellishment or attitude. When it was over and he was leaving the courthouse, he paused at the door to courtroom 4B. Through the window, he could see Rebecca still working, listening intently to arguments in another case. She looked natural up there, like she'd always belonged in that seat. Officer Hayes stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked away. He had a lot to think about, a lot to learn. And maybe, just maybe, he'd been given a gift today, the gift of seeing what true dignity and professionalism actually looked like. The lesson had been delivered, not through revenge or humiliation, but through example. And somehow that made it more powerful than anything else could have been. News traveled fast in the legal community. By the end of that first day, everyone in the courthouse knew what had happened. By the end of the week, the story had spread to every law office in the county. A police officer had mocked a woman in court, not knowing she was about to become the judge. And when she took the bench, she'd handled it with more grace and professionalism than most people could have managed. The story took on a life of its own. Some people embellished it, adding dramatic details that weren't quite accurate. But the core truth remained the same. Rebecca Chen had responded to disrespect not with revenge but with dignity. And that resonated with people in a way that surprised even her. Lawyers started requesting to appear in her courtroom. Not because they thought she'd be a pushover. That first week made it clear she was sharp and wouldn't tolerate nonsense. But because word spread that her courtroom was fair, that she actually listened, that she treated everyone, from the most expensive defense attorney to the most nervous defendant, with the same level of respect. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after that first day, Rebecca was in her chambers reviewing case files when Mrs. Patterson knocked on the door. "Your Honor, there's someone here asking to speak with you. Says it's personal." Rebecca looked up surprised. Her calendar was packed with cases and she rarely had time for unscheduled meetings. "Who is it?" Mrs. Patterson's expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes. "Officer Hayes." Rebecca set down her pen. She'd seen Hayes in court twice more since that first day, both times for testimony in other cases. He'd been professional, even subdued, but they hadn't spoken directly. She could have refused the meeting. She certainly would have been justified in doing so. But something told her this conversation needed to happen. "Send him in." Officer Hayes entered the chambers looking nothing like the confident, swaggering man who'd mocked her 3 weeks earlier. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously. His uniform was crisp and clean, but his shoulders were slightly hunched like he was carrying a heavy weight. "Your Honor, thank you for seeing me. I know you're busy and I don't want to take up too much of your time." Rebecca gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Officer Hayes." He sat, still clutching his hat. For a moment he didn't speak, seeming to struggle with how to begin. Finally he looked up and met her eyes. "I owe you an apology, a real one." He took a breath. "What I said to you that first morning, the way I treated you, it was completely out of line, unprofessional, disrespectful, and wrong." Rebecca listened without interrupting. Hayes continued, his voice steady but clearly emotional. "I've been a police officer for 15 years. I thought I was good at reading people, at sizing up situations. But that morning showed me something I didn't want to see about myself. I made assumptions about you based on nothing, on how you looked, where you were sitting, what you were wearing. And I was completely wrong." "You were," Rebecca said simply. "The thing is," Hayes went on, "it wasn't the first time I'd done something like that. Maybe not that blatant, but I've made assumptions about people my whole career. Looked at someone and decided I knew their story before they even opened their mouth. As a cop, you tell yourself you're just being observant, using your experience. But really I was just being prejudiced." He set his hat on his knee and looked down at it. "What really got to me wasn't just that I was wrong about you. It was how you handled it. You had every right to throw the book at me that day, to embarrass me, to make an example of me. And you didn't. You just did your job fairly. That said more than any lecture could have." Rebecca leaned back in her chair. "Officer Hayes, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Honor." "Why do you think I didn't humiliate you that day?" Hayes thought about it. "Honestly, I've been asking myself that for 3 weeks. It's because humiliation doesn't change people," Rebecca said. "It just makes them defensive, makes them dig in deeper on their beliefs. I could have torn you apart in front of everyone and maybe it would have felt good in the moment. But what would it have accomplished? You'd have resented me. You'd have felt victimized instead of actually learning anything." She folded her hands on her desk. "Besides, I've been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment too many times to want to inflict it on someone else. Even someone who deserved it." Hayes nodded slowly. "I appreciate that more than you know. And I want you to know I've been doing some real thinking about how I do my job. I've started questioning my own assumptions when I'm out on patrol, asking myself why I'm making certain stops, why I'm approaching people certain ways. It's uncomfortable seeing your own biases, but it's necessary." "That's good," Rebecca said. "That's how we grow." "I've also been talking to some of the younger officers," Hayes added. "Sharing what happened. Not the embarrassing parts, but the lesson. Trying to help them see what I didn't see until it was too late. That every person deserves respect, regardless of how they look or what we assume about them." Rebecca studied him for a moment. The man sitting in front of her seemed genuinely changed. Not completely transformed, that would take time, but willing to do the work. And that was what mattered. "I appreciate you coming here today, Officer Hayes. That took courage." He stood up, putting his hat back on. "Thank you, Your Honor. And for what it's worth, I think this county is lucky to have you as a judge." After he left, Rebecca sat quietly in her chambers for a few minutes. She thought about her mother, still working those 2 jobs even though Rebecca had offered to help her retire. Her mother insisted she didn't need to stop yet, that she liked staying busy. But Rebecca knew the real reason. Her mother wanted to keep contributing to maintain her independence, to not be a burden. She thought about all the people she'd represented as a public defender. The ones who'd been judged before ever setting foot in a courtroom, the ones who'd been treated like they didn't matter because of where they came from or what they looked like. She'd fought for them because she knew what it felt like to be underestimated, dismissed, and counted out. Now, in this position, she had the power to make sure her courtroom was different. That it was a place where people were truly judged by facts and law, not by appearances or assumptions. Over the following months, Rebecca's reputation continued to grow. Her courtroom became known as one of the fairest in the county. She was tough. Lawyers who came unprepared learned that quickly, but she was consistently fair. She didn't give preferential treatment to prosecutors or defense attorneys, to wealthy defendants or poor ones. Everyone got the same careful attention. She started a mentorship program, reaching out to young lawyers from backgrounds similar to hers. Law students who were the first in their families to attend college, who worked multiple jobs to pay for school, who didn't have the connections or resources that others had. She met with them regularly, offering guidance and encouragement, reminding them that they belonged in this profession, that their perspective and experience were valuable. Officer Hayes kept his word. He became an advocate for better training in his department, particularly around implicit bias and respectful community engagement. He volunteered to speak at the police academy, sharing his story with new recruits. Not the version where he was the hero, but the honest version, where he'd been wrong and had to learn a hard lesson about respect and assumptions. 6 months after that first day, Rebecca was leaving the courthouse late one evening when she saw a young woman standing outside looking nervous. The woman was clutching a folder, and she looked like she'd been waiting for a while. "Can I help you?" Rebecca asked. The young woman straightened up. "Judge Chen? I'm sorry to bother you. I heard about you, about your story, and I wanted to thank you." "Thank you for what?" "I'm in my 2nd year of law school," the young woman said, "and I've been struggling. Not with the work, I can do the work, but with feeling like I belong. Everyone else seems to come from these legal families or they have all these connections, and I'm working 3 jobs and barely keeping up. I was thinking about quitting." Rebecca's heart squeezed. She knew that feeling intimately. "But then I heard your story," the woman continued, "and it reminded me why I wanted to do this in the first place. That people like us were supposed to be here. Our perspective matters. So I just wanted to say thank you for showing people like me that it's possible." Rebecca smiled and reached out to squeeze the young woman's hand. "What's your name?" "Taylor. Taylor Nguyen." "Well, Taylor, you keep going. Keep working hard. Keep believing in yourself. And when it gets difficult, and it will get difficult, remember that you're not doing this just for yourself. You're doing it for everyone who comes after you, for everyone who needs someone who understands their story." Taylor nodded, blinking back tears. "Thank you, Your Honor." As Rebecca walked to her car, she thought about that moment in the courtroom 6 months ago, the moment that could have gone so many different ways. She'd made a choice that day, to respond with grace instead of revenge, with professionalism instead of pettiness, and now she saw the ripples of that choice spreading outward in ways she never could have anticipated. The story wasn't really about Officer Hayes or his apology. It wasn't even really about her appointment as a judge. It was about something bigger, about how we treat each other, about the assumptions we make, and about the power of responding to disrespect with dignity. Years from now, people might forget the specific details. They might not remember the exact words that were said, or even the names of the people involved. But they'd remember the lesson. They'd remember that a woman was mocked in a courtroom, and when she took the judge's seat seconds later, she chose to be better than the person who'd wronged her. And that choice, that single decision to respond with grace, had changed more than just one morning in one courtroom. It had started conversations, challenged assumptions, and inspired people like Taylor to keep fighting for their place in a profession that often seemed designed to keep them out. Rebecca unlocked her car and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. Her mother had been right.